what they do.
Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Lamed Vov. In Avodah Zarah, we learn for Chanukah Beis Yisrael and soon Basar V'Shivya. We'll start with the last line, the last half line on daf Lamed Hamed Beis. Shemen. What are we talking about? The Mishnah said. Then we're talking about things that you're not allowed to. The Medic Xeris that you shouldn't have these things of Avodah Zarah, but you're not supposed to eat them. But they're not also bahana. It's not like really Avodah Zarah, but they make Xeris about these things. Among them are milk that was milked by non-Jews, and there's no Jew observing it. There's no mashkiach. Today, there's different rules. For example, of Moshe Feinstein's famous thing that in America, you can rest assured that the milk is all kosher, because if they would mix up any non-kosher milk in there, they would lose their license, and there would be, millions of dollars of loss.
It doesn't work anymore. The U.S. Department of Farming or Agriculture passed a law that camel's milk is milk. So now you can have.
So it's a new thing, yeah. So you got to have a hashgacha. Okay, all right. So that's good. Thank you for that update. One of the other things that was usher was pas, their bread. And we'll see that they're heterim for that in certain situations. And shemen, oil. That's what we're going to talk about now. Shemen. Says the Gemara, the last line on the page on Lamed Hamed Beis. Shemen. Two is a machlokas. What was the reason why they forbade it? Rav Amar Daniel Gazrulov. Daniel, the Navi Daniel made the Jewish leader. He made a gzeira, he decreed that you shouldn't have oil. Now, the reason you shouldn't eat their oil, again, the reason here is basically because of chasnus. In other words, you shouldn't come to mix with them, socialize with them, and you might come to intermarry. So Shemen Rav says the reason is because of Daniel. Shmuel says no. The reason is Shmuel Amars Lifasan Shal Kalim Tmeim Osrasan. The reason you shouldn't use their oil is not that there's a problem with the oil or there's a problem with the that it might not be kosher. See, with the Rav said, it just comes. It's just their oil might be kosher. No problem with that. But we don't want you to socialize with them. If you have their oil, you'll come to have meals with them, etc. He says no. The reason is because the residue in the kalim of their kalim tmeim. If they have defiled kalim, that's what you shouldn't use. Says Gemara, what do you mean? So what if they're defiled? Kalim, all the kalim we use today are tamei, right? We're not, we don't have real tara today. Atu kol yalma ochel tarasin. Everybody just only eats tara. So what's wrong if they're kalim tmeim? Tmeim here means that they are defiled. They're spiritually defiled. Elz lifasin shel kalim asurim osusan. Oh, the residue of kalim which are also because there's something treif in them. That's right. So there's the reason you shouldn't have their oil is because sometimes they take the leftover residue oil in their pot that they cook chazer in or whatever, and they mix that, they use that oil to make your glatt kosher meal, So because of that, that's the reason. So we have machlokes Rav and Shmuel. So Rav says it's simply a gzeira. Shmuel says because you might have non-kosher oil in there. Amalei Shmuel Rav. I who say that the reason why their shemen is so good is because it's the residue of non-kosher of oil that was cooked with, let's say, with chazer, and that might be mixed up with the oil that you're using now. So Hainu the Chiyos Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel makes sense. When Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Bar Morsa came to Omer, and he said, Dorish Rav Samloi expounded Ben Etzivan, Shemen Rav Yehuda Ubeis Dino Nimno Lavi Tiru. They were materit. Why were they materit? They asked it at one point because they said, okay, listen, you might get the residue from their chazer, from their chazer roast or something like that in there. And then it makes sense. Okay, it was also for a while because he thought it was not kosher, like it didn't have hashgacha. And then Rabbi Yehuda and his bezin came along and they were matrik. Now in our Mishnah, we also talk about Rebbe Ubeis Dino Itiru. We'll see what we're talking about. It's not really Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. This is like a later addition, Rebbe Ubeis Dino Itiru, because the author of the Mishnah usually is Rebbe, but he just says that this is really Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's grandson. He's also called Rabbi Yehuda Nasi or Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya. We'll see that on tomorrow's Gemara, that Rebbe's grandson, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's grandson, who was also Rabbi Yehuda, he was materit. So I understand. He says, why he was materit? Because originally, let's say it didn't have hashgacha, and you thought it might be treif, came from non-kosher pot or whatever, and they were materit. Why? Because why was he materit? Oh, you know what his reason is? Not all of a sudden that he had hashgacha now, because if you're getting their oil from the goyim, what's the hashgacha there? No, the reason is because here the oil might give a worsened taste. In other words, if the product that you're putting in, and it's obviously it's less than a shear and it's bottle and all that, but if it's giving a taste which worsens, and it's a bad thing, meaning if you're using residue oil, which is only going to make something taste worse, that's mutter. So that's his svara. I understand why he was matter oil later on. In other words, Amisha said that originally it was Xera, don't have their milk, and don't have their bread, and don't have their shemen. Oh, why don't have their shemen? Because there might be a residue of non-kosher oil in there. Rabbi later on said, no, it's okay, because even if there's a residue, that's only going to make it worse. You're going to have like all spoiled oil is only going to make your dish worse. She said, that's why it's mutter. But you, Rav, who say, Daniel Gosselov, that Daniel made Xera, don't have their oil because he might come to socialize with them. So Daniel goes of us, if Daniel, who was a leader of the Jewish people, who was biblical, right? He was in the Bible in Tanakh. He came along and made Xera. Could Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, again, this is Rabbi's grandson, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, could he come and void that Xera? He can't do it for time. We learn one bezdin cannot nullify the psak of another bezdin, Elam Ke Gadol Men, unless the second bezdin that's trying to nullify the first one is greater than a bechachma in wisdom, of a minion, and a number. And certainly you can't say that Rabbi Yehuda was greater than Daniel. So according to you, how did Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, we'll call him Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, how did he nullify the Xera? If it was because of Xera of Daniel, how could he nullify that? Amalei Simloi Ludota Kamrit. So Rav answered him, where'd you hear this from? You heard this from Rav Simloi Minitzivin. As we said, he says, Rav Shmuel says, yes, Shem Bezin V'Yitiru. Says, you heard this from Simloi Kamrit. Shalom Dotam is also, the answer is their takum is also. In other words, you know why? Because they make fun of, they don't carefully observe the rules, the people from Lud. Amalei, Ashlachei, should I send for him? Should I send for him so you can question him yourself and he could give you his ruling? Ichsav. So Rav was a little bit embarrassed by that because Rav said, right? Shmuel said to him, according to you, that it was Xera of Daniel. How could Rabbi Yehuda Nasi have come along and be mavatal it? How could they be mizalsel? The answer is, you asking me kasha from them? They were mizalsel. They talk, that they said that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was matra, but maybe he really wasn't. Amarav, im heimlo darsh, if they didn't darshan it correctly, in other words, they didn't feel that Daniel had been Xera against it, a non-lo darshin, and we won't darshan it. I'll explain to you how I know that Daniel was made a decree against the oil of Goyim. It says, Vayosam Daniel alibo, he took it to his heart, Asher lo yizgol b'fas bag hamelech, that he shouldn't defile himself with the foods. Pasbag means like all the foods of the king, uvayayin mishtav, and the wines of his drinkings. Mishtav is a plural lashon. B'shtei mishtav sekasam daber, two kinds of drinks. Ech mishem bechet mishtei shemen. So you see that Daniel said, I'm not going to have anything, I'm not going to have their food, and I'm not going to have their wine or their oil. So that's the problem. So what are you telling me? He came along and he was matrid afterwards? Rab Savar Ali Bosam L'cha Yisrael Hora. He took it to heart. In other words, he said, not a good idea to eat their bread, eat their food, and drink their drinks, whether it's wine or oil. Shmuel felt no, Savar Ali Bosam L'cha Yisrael Hora. He took it to himself. He was machmer for himself, but he didn't paskin that all Yisrael shouldn't have it. And therefore, he said therefore Shmuel said the reason for the Isser was simply because they thought you might be eating treif shemen mixed with their that they use for chaz or whatever. And later on, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi came along and said, no, it's no tam lefkam, and therefore it's mutter. Says the Gemara of Hashem. So that was the machlokas here. Rav felt that Daniel made Xera for all of Bnei Yisrael, and Shmuel says no, he only was machmer for himself. Says the Gemara of Hashem and Daniel gozer. It was really true that Daniel was gozer on Shemen, even according to Rav Amar Bali, that's his name. Avime Nifso, Avime from that place, Mishmei Rav said, Pitam Ushmeinon Yenon B'Nasein Kulam Mishmon Aser Davarhead. Their bread, their oil, their wine, and their daughters are all from the 18 Xeras that Beis Hillel and Meshami made together when they were sitting in Aliyah. So what do you mean that Daniel made Xera? It says that their oil was made Xera later on by the Talmidim of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. It says B'chitem also Daniel goes over lo kibul. Maybe you'll tell me Daniel made Xera, but it wasn't accepted by the masses. And they made Xera. The Talmud of Vasham came in, they made Xera, was accepted. So what did Rav say? We started today's Gemara by saying, why was Shemin prohibited, the Shemin of the Goyim? Rav says, because the Neil was Gozer. But if the Neil's Xera was never accepted, then it's not really Xera. It wasn't accepted. Say Beisil Beshamai. Ella Daniel Gozer, Ella, I'll tell you what happened. Daniel really did make a Xera, but he made it only a Xera in the city, meaning when you'll have contact, if you have their oil in the city where there's a lot of people there, you'll come to socialize with them and intermarry. They came like even when there's no concern about socializing, you shouldn't have it at all. That was the Xera that they made. So it's more of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So okay, how did Rabbi Yehuda Nasi taka? How could he be matter? If you held me like Shmuel, that the Xera wasn't really Xera. Shemin was also because they thought it was treif. And Rabbi Yehuda come along and said, no, it's no Sintam of Kam, it's mutter. But if Daniel made Xera, how could Rabbi Yehuda Nasi come in Vatla? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Hechimatzal Mishrei, Takanta, Tamid Sham, even if you don't say that it was from Daniel, that Daniel only made the city Xera in the city, and they made the Xera even in the Sada, so how could they take away that Xera? How could Rabbi Yehuda Nasi come along and take away the Xera? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was an early Amora, right? His grandfather was the Rebbe, was the end of the Tanam, so he was an early Amora. How could he take away from Talmidei Besham Yisrael who were Tanoim? How could they nullify the Xera of Shammai Hill? Like we said before, a second bezin cannot nullify and retract and overrule the bezin, the earlier bezin. Elim can't go to man unless it was greater than wisdom and in number. If they are greater in wisdom and in number, a second bezin can nullify the psak of the first one. Except for those 18 things that we just mentioned, Davar, Shafil Yov Elio Bezdino. Even if Elio and his bezin would come along and be vatal the 18 ancient, we would listen to him. So number one, how could Rabbi Yehuda Nasi have been vatal the words of the Talmidim Beshel Veshamai? And second of all, if it's among the 18 things that they paskin Bethil and Beshamai together, and this is among them, nobody can nullify that. Amar Mashasha Matam, what's the reason why you say you can't be vatal? Since what? What's the reason that nobody can vatal those 18? Because their Isser was accepted, their Isser was spread out among all Bnei Yisrael. In other words, it was an accustomed rule that they don't drink the Shemen. But Shemen, the other 18, it was spread and it was accepted. Shemen lo Pashri Surah. But the rule about the oil, Daniel, that only goes in the city. The Talmud Beshami where goes all over it, right? Out in the fields, even where there's no social contact. But that rule that they had instituted, that decree, lo pashri surah barov Yisrael, most of the Jews didn't accept it. It was too hard to maintain because they needed the oil of the goyim. The rabbis checked, they said, and they checked, they searched, investigated it. Al shemen shelo pashri surah barov Yisrael. Even though the Xera was made not to use the goyish shemen, again, not if there are no, but only Yisra to eat it. But they checked around, and the Yisra was never accepted among most Jews. And therefore, they relied on what the Rav Shimon had said. They used to say, "Ein goes you can't make Xera unless most people can maintain it, can fulfill that Xera." And apparently, with the oil, even though the rabbis tried to make Xera, it was never universally accepted. It was too hard to maintain. How do you know this? From my car, what he sees in the pasuk. Pasuk says in Malachi, you are cursed, right? You are cursed. You took Xera with a curse. If you don't accept the Xera, you will be cursed if you violate it. And then you lie to me. You don't accept the curse. You violate the curse. The Hagoy Kulo, the entire nation, they dash like this. If most of the nation, the Jewish people, have accepted it, then you're going to be cursed if you violate it. But if most of the Jews have not accepted it, then you are not cursed for not observing that Xera. Gufa. Amar Bali, what did we say on Amar? Bali said Amar Avime Nifsa. Avime from Nifsa, from Nivas, or Nifsa said Mishmei Durav. Piton Mishmei Yonim are saying Chul Mishmei also Davar Haim. Their bread, their food, and their oil, and the wine, and their daughters, the Goyish daughters, are all from the 18 things that Shem Bisilul made Xera. Says right there, of 18 things. In other words, even though we say Shemin was part of the Xera, but as we said, maybe Rabbi Nasi overruled it later on because he saw that it was never accepted among the Jews. Okay, but the wine we know, Stam Yenim is Asr. As we said before, Stam Yenim is Asr. Even Bahanoah, maybe not Bisman Azeh, Stam Yenim is not Asr Bahanoah, but at least it's Asr. And their daughters, as Gemara ben Asayimai, what do you mean their daughters are Asr? We're talking about non-Jewish women, right? We're talking about Xeris that they made to stay away from, not to socialize with the goyim, that you shouldn't come to intermarry. And among those things you say, they made a Xera about the daughters. What does it mean? Rav Nachman Yitzchak Gazral ben Asayim Nidos. Obviously, we'll see later on, there's Psukim indicating you're not supposed to marry a non-Jewish woman, but they made a Xera that their daughters are Nidos Mary Sasa, that as soon as they're babies, a baby could also menstruate in theory. I mean, it can happen in some cases, right? So he says their daughters are Nidos Mary Sasa, meaning we assume that their daughters, even when baby girl, non-Jewish women, are considered Nidos, even though Goyim cannot be a Nida. As we said many times, only a Jewish person can be Tameh while they're alive. Dead people are all Tameh because they're dead, right? Parker says, but live people are only Usr, live animals too, are only not Tameh unless they're dead, except for Jews. Jews can be Tameh. Jew could be a Zava could touch a dead body, can have a seminal emission, right? A Jewish woman could be a Nida or a Zava. Non-Jewish women don't have those rules. She can menstruate, but she's not Tameh. But they made a Xera that she's like a Nida, so you'll stay away from them. Says if we can even mishmei Rav Amar, kula mishmei Rav. In other words, what's the reason they made a Xera? They made a Xera on what does it mean by saying? It says made a Xera that the non-Jewish woman should be considered a Nida as soon as they're born. Even non-Jewish baby girls should be considered Nida, so that you should stay away from them, right? Right, so you should stay away from them. Now, Geneva said in the name of Rav, a different Rav said, all these rules are also because of you might come to worship Avodah Zarah, Gosbred. The Chiyasa Ravada Barav Amar Yitzchaki said, Gozral Pitam Shem Shmena. They made example you shouldn't have their bread because you might come to have the oil. So Gemara, what difference does it make? Why is it you should make example on the bread because you might come to eat them? My umid the Shem Pas. Why Shemin is worse than Pas? They're both Xeris here anyway, right? So why is that? Elal Pitam Shmenim Shemyena. They made a Xera that you shouldn't eat their bread or their food and their oil because you might come then to drink the wine. The wine is already could be Yayin Nesach, and you shouldn't drink their wine. This must mean Stam Yenam, right? They made Xera in the Stam Yenam because if it's really Yayin Nesach, it's also Torah, it's Avodah Zarah. But on Stam Yenam, Mishum Rasayim, because if you drink their wine, you might come to sleep with their daughters. And what's the reason why there's a Xera that you shouldn't be with their daughters? And we're going to talk about it. What do you mean a Xera? Isn't that Minat Torah that you shouldn't be with the non-Jewish woman? But at this point, we're saying that no, they made a Xera about the daughters because that will lead to Avodah Zarah. Davar Acher means Avodah Zarah. Davar Acher always means something that the rabbis don't want to talk about. Davar Acher sometimes can mean Chazer. Davar Acher can mean Avodah Zarah. Here it means Avodah Zarah. And then on another matter, they made a Xer Mishum Davar Acher because of another Davar Acher. We don't even know what that is yet. We'll come to it. But the first thing is they made a Xer on the daughters, on the non-Jewish daughters, the Goyish daughters, because of you'll come to Avodah Zarah. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? But I'm saying Daraisi. What do you mean they made a Xer that you shouldn't marry a non-Jewish woman because you might come to do Avodah Zarah? It's Torah also. Don't marry the shiksas. As the Rai says, I know it's the Chadma is only going on the 7 nations that inhabited Eretz Canaan, Eretz Yisrael in those days. But it doesn't apply to the Chadma. Also Inu, and they made Xera, and Shammai and Hillel, the Tamid Shammai made Xera because I feel the Shar have come even not other Goyish women also, not just the 7 nations. In other words, all non-Jewish women are also. Pasuk says, why shouldn't your son marry a non-Jewish woman because she will because the grandchildren she will take to Avodah Zarah. Ki Yasir has been Chameachrai. The Rabbos Kol Masiras, all non-Jewish women. Not as the pasuk is indicating, not just the Zion Umos Olam, the 7 Umos, the Kanani, the Prizi, etc., but all non-Jewish women. So the pasuk is telling you all Jewish women. Why do you tell me that they made a Xera on the other nations, the other non-Jewish nations? According to Rav Shimon Yochai, the pasuk Yasir ben Charchai means any non-Jewish woman will take away your children from your son and your grandchildren from Jewish worship, and they'll cause them to do avodah zarah. So you see, it's the oraisa. Michael, what are you going to say? So what was the gzeira about chiksas? It's minatorah. El doraisa ishus derachasnas. Minatorah, it's only usher to marry them. Don't marry them. But you shouldn't sleep with them, period. The snusnami, what do you mean? This also, but Bezdin Shel Shem was originally assered from the Bezdin of Shem in Chumash Breishis. God's the Chassidus says, Vayomi Yehuda, Otziyu of a Sisarif. Remember, this is the story with Tamar, right? When Tamar became pregnant, Yehuda didn't know that it was from him, and they assumed that she had slept with a sheketz or somebody, right? So he says, take her out and burn her. Now, what's the idea of burn her? Where did they have that halacha? Where did you get that halacha from? Either because in those days it was B'nai Noach all say that mitzvah, or because Shem was like a Kohen, and the Kohen's, and she was a descendant of Shem, so treat her like a Bas Kohen. Farshim grapple with that. Rashi doesn't help us here, but the idea is that you see that it was already a gzeira already in the Chumash Bereshis from the time of Shem, that it was already. So what do you say that they made a gzeira that even derech snus? That's what Shammai Ben said. You don't sleep with the shiksa, even derech snus. Here it's mashma from Chumash Bereshis that was already also then, not from the gzeira of Shammai and Hillel. El daraisa v'kechavim abal bas Yisrael. Minatorah, it's only a bas Yisrael shouldn't sleep with a goy, the mashcha basrei, because he will pull her to avodah zarah, and that's what they assumed with Tamar also, that they didn't know it was Yehuda. They thought it was Rova Olam. She slept with somebody, probably was a goy because he go bas a rove. Right, only there. Aval Yisrael abal bas kechavim, but a Yisrael who sleeps with a non-Jewish woman, lo, that's not also min haTorah, or not also from the time of Breishis. And they made Xera, Shammai and Hill made Xera, that even a Jewish man who sleeps with a non-Jewish woman, that's also usher. So more Yisrael above Kachavim, Lachem Sinai. That's Lachem Sinai. The Damar Mar. We just had the story of Pinchas. Habala Ramas Kanam Pogambo. If a Jewish man sleeps with a non-Jewish woman, a Kanai is allowed to kill him, as we saw with Pinchas. Ella, the rice of a Hesi, that's only for Hesu, like the story of Zimri and Cosby. Only that story, which was public, and therefore was a special Chil Hashem. There you're allowed to pass. So in goes Rafila B'tzina. They made a Xera that a Jewish man should not sleep with a non-Jewish woman, even in private. So B'tzina Nami Bezdin Shal Chashmonai Gozu. Again, I'll show you that the Bezdin of the Chashmonaim, at least that's more biblical, before time of Shammai and Hillel, they made a Xera. The Chiyas of Dim came to Amar Bezdin Shal Chashmonai Gozu Yisrael above us Chayev. He's Chayev Mishum Nashga. What is Nashga? In other words, it's not really, if you're talking about sleeping with a non-Jewish, remember, a non-Jewish woman can never be a nida, min Torah, but he considers it like a nida. In other words, they made it zera. What Nashga is abbreviation for nida, shifcha, goita, like Averes Kachavim, right? Averes Kachavim, and Eishes Ish. Aleph is for Eishes Ish, meaning they're not really over on those things, but we're afraid that they made Xera, don't sleep with a non-Jewish woman, because then you'll come to sleep with a non-Jewish woman. Certainly doesn't go to the mikveh, even though halachically Minator she's not a nida. But if you sleep with her, you'll come to sleep with a nida, and you'll come to marry a shifcha, and you'll be over in La Kadesh, and you'll come to marry an Avodas Kachavim, and you'll be over in La Sischatan, and you'll come to be over on Eishes Ish too. So he says that if you sleep with an Avodas Kachavim, you're chayv mishum nashga. Kiasa Rabban came from so he had a different version. Amar mishum nashgas. He takes up Eishes Ish and he puts in Zion for zona. Because a Kohen can't sleep with a Zona, you'll come to be over. Not that she's a Zona. A non-Jewish woman doesn't have the halacha of a Zona. A Zona is a Jewish woman who slept with somebody she's not allowed to marry. But in any case, the point is that this is all the Xera of the Chashmonaim. Again, it's not Minator, but they made Xera. So again, what do you mean that Shammai and Hillel made Xera on their daughters? It's not marrying them. That's all we saw in the Torah, right? Marrying them is all in the Torah. And if you say if it's a Jewish man, a Goyish man with a Jewish woman, that was we saw from Yehud and Tamar, from the story of Tamar, then we want to say they made a Xera that a Jewish man should not sleep with a non-Jewish woman, and that's what they said. And we said, what do you mean? That's isn't that Allah Moshe Sinai that Habol Ramos come? That's only for Hesi, not B'tzina. But B'tzina also we're saying now the Chashmonah already goes on that. Says the Gemara in the first of the wide lines. In the Gemara, Kigas are based in Shachashmonai Bia. They made it clear you can't sleep with a non-Jewish woman. even in private. Aval yichud lo, but you could be secluded with her. They didn't make such exera. Va'asuinu, and Shaman the Hill came along and said, Gozar fil yichud. You can't even be secluded with a non-Jewish woman. This is more yichud nami bezdin shel David Gozru. The bezdin of David, again, which is biblical, they were Gozar on that. Dam Rav Yehuda Ba'osa Shah at the time that happened with the terrible story of David's children, right? David's children, the story of Amnon and Tamar, different Tamar, right? That story of Amnon and Tamar, Gozru al yichud. You shouldn't even be together with them at all. Don't be secluded. That's where a Jewish girl should not be secluded with a man. Aval yichud lo. But if a man is secluded with a non-Jewish woman, they didn't make that gzera. David HaMelech didn't make that gzera, and the gzera of Chashmon was only on having deal with them, but not being secluded with them. And even David was only gozer on a Jewish girl. Basuinu and Shamil came along gozer. Afila yichud was chavim that a Jewish man should not even be secluded with a non-Jewish woman. Said more yichud bas Yisrael daraisi, but yichud bas Yisrael, you say what? That David HaMelech was gozer. Isn't that min Torah? The Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Shim Yosada. Rem is lichud min Torah. How do we know that you're not supposed to have yichud? Where's the source in the Torah? The hint Shenemar ki yasischa achicha benimecha. If your brother will incite you to avodah zarah, it says benimecha, the son of your mother, your brother, the son of your mother. Ben aim mesis ben have ames. What does it do with the son of your mother and the son of your father cannot be mesis? Ela ben misyach limim will tell you that a boy is coming to Ben Imcha is allowed. A boy is allowed to be secluded with his mother. You're not concerned about an Oedipus there. But nobody else is allowed to be secluded with other arayas Shabbatar, meaning even with sisters, let's say, or relatives, or anybody else. Certainly with married women, whatever. Yeah, okay, but the point is that we saw it already, but David didn't introduce it as a question. Did David introduce the concept of yichud with a bas Yisrael? We see it already hinted at in the Torah, right? And it's a shaila whether yichud today is that min Torah or is it from Xera of David HaMelech, right? But you see a remnant in it. So then yichud darais deishasish. Min Torah is considered only shouldn't be secluded with a married woman. In other words, David only goes on Jewish women. Shaman Hill goes even a non-Jewish woman. But David, the Minatorah, it was already only usher on a Ish. Whereas David came along and he ushered even a woman who was single and not married. You shouldn't be secluded with her either. Again, what's the terrible sin? You're not supposed to sleep with somebody unless you marry them, right? And you shouldn't be secluded with a woman who's not even married. Right, you might come to do something which is also.
Why not bring an example from Sota? Sota, you have a
Right. Yeah, but we don't see there that there's. In other words, Sota is only usher when the husband suspects her, and he warned her. Then afterwards, there were Adam that they were saying. Here we're talking about how do you know that you're not supposed to be? Let's say even a single girl. There's no sot. She says sot is only if she's married to someone. She's married, right? Even a single girl. How do you know that she shouldn't be secluded with somebody? That's what you know. So David HaMelech goes there on a Jewish girl, right? But David only goes there on a Jewish woman who's married. We said, right? Right. I'm sorry, but Minatorah. We said it isn't Minatorah. That the Minatorah it was only if she's married. And David goes there even on a Pnuya. Now you say, right? So that's the thing. You're asking maybe. What do we need the pasuk? We see it from Sota. Sota doesn't say from Sota. You wouldn't know that she's not allowed to be secluded with a man if she's at a meeting and she's not secluded with a man. It's only if he suspects her. If he suspects her and he warns her, then if she's secluded and there's Adam, she becomes a Sota and he has to go through the process.
David say examples of variety and sex. He's being offender of God.
Yeah, well, first of all, we said that it was the Bezdin of David HaMelech that was Gozer, right? Bezdino Shel David was made Xera. And whatever we say, the Gemara that goes to the whole issue of he considered himself a sinner, but the Gemara says whoever says that he really committed adultery is wrong. So whatever the excuse was that she wasn't married or there was a get or whatever it was, whatever the excuses were. That Uri had been killed, or was on his way to death, or whatever the thing was, it certainly wasn't something, it wasn't certainly a story of honor, and also say that he really wouldn't have been fallen, but it was to teach us the concept of tshuva, that you could do tshuva, whatever the thing was there. But it was his best and who made that gzeira. Maybe they made the gzeira after the story too, but the story of Amnon and Tamar also, that's when they made the gzeira. That's what he says. At that time, when the story happened with Amnon and Tamar, they made that gzeira, even Yichud. Again, the Minatorah, the gzeira was for Minatorah, it wasn't gzeira. Minatorah, we see that it was be secluded for an Ashes Ish. An Ashes Ish should not be secluded with a man shouldn't be with an Ashes Ish. Doubles goes, or even if she's single. So what happened? So Minatorah, let's say you shouldn't be secluded with an Ashes Ish, right? With an Ashes Ish. David HaMelech came to even on a single Jewish girl. Talmid Beis Shammai came along and said, even on a shiksa, it shouldn't be secluded even with a shiksa. So he said, we made gzeira, all those things we said, the pas and the shemen and the yayin, was all because of avodah zarah, right? Well, because eventually it might lead to avodah zarah and their daughters, because if you're secluded with their daughters, now what was gzeira? If you come, that you shouldn't be secluded even with a non-Jewish woman, because you might come to then do in other words, even not that you shouldn't be secluded with them. You shouldn't even be secluded, even if there's no hanky-panky. You shouldn't be secluded with them because you'll come to do avodah zarah. And then we said they were gozer on davrach mishavdach. What does that mean? It's like gozer al tinok of a that you shouldn't, that a non-Jewish boy, a non-Jewish baby, is also tamesh itam beziva. Again, even though we said that a live non-Jewish being of any sort, a human being or an animal, cannot be tameh. But they made a gzeira on, we said before, on non-Jewish women that they are like a nida, and they made also gzeira that a non-Jewish boy is also tameh, like a zav. So he shouldn't be near a Jewish, and as we shouldn't, that Jewish boys should not mix with non-Jewish boys, so they shouldn't come to homosexuality or sodomy. I had a big question to Rav Asi. We couldn't solve it. Rav Asi went to Esel Rav Yochanan. He asked Rav Yochanan. Esel Rav Yana. He asked Rav Yana. Rav Yana Esel Rebbe. Esel Rav Nosson ben Amram went to Rav Nosson ben Amram. Rav Nachman ben Amram. Esel Rebbe. He had this question. Tinok avikachavim. This gzeira again that they made, that Shaman Hill made. Among those 18 things, they said a tinok who's a goy, a baby goy, is tamei midrabanan. They made gzeira, so you shouldn't come to mix with them. At what age is a tamei beziva? V'amrli ben yomo. Yes, ben yomo, even from one day. Shabbos is Rav Chia. When I came to Rav Chia, that was Rabbi's uncle. Amrli, he said, Rab's uncle rather. Rav Chia Amrli ben teisha only from these 9 years old and a day, from the time that he capable of having bia. When I came back and I told my words before Rabbi, who had told me even from the baby, as soon as it's born, Amrli hanach divrei devarai, leave my words. I said that the goyish baby is tamei, goyish baby boy is tamei from birth. Leave what I said. Remember, ochos divrei Rav Chia. Take what Rav Chia said. Go with that. That's only tamei from 9 years old and a day from his 9th birthday. Domer tinik avikachov meimasam mitamei beziva betosh shem biacham, meaning from his 9th birthday. Hoel v'roy lebia, since he get a bia then. Since he's capable of having bia, he has emissions also. If he has, he's also tamei beziva, meaning even if he didn't have a zav, we're not saying that he actually had a seminal emission or some sort of gonorrhea emission, which is classified as zav. We said it's gzeira. Goyish kids should be considered tamei, that you shouldn't come to mix with them. Amravina Hilkach. Therefore, we say we're in the second line now in Zamazayin. Hilkach Haitinok. If you have a non-Jewish baby girl, remember we said before that they were gozer on non-Jewish women, that they are considered nidos from birth. Right? We said before, Rav Nachman Yitzchak said that Alpana saying that meant that they're tamei from that point. Here we're saying later on that the gzeira was that you shouldn't come to mingle with them. And as one opinion was, we said that Rav Nachman Yitzchak said they were gozer on their daughters, that they're nidas from the time of their birth. Another pshat, Rikmina said no, they were gozer all because of avodah zarah, that you shouldn't even mix, meaning the gzeira was you shouldn't even be secluded with a non-Jewish woman because of the lead to avodah zarah. But now, so we said you shouldn't be secluded with them, and therefore we said that And then we said there's another Xera that the non-Jewish baby boys, you shouldn't mix with them either. They said they're Tameh. What about a non-Jewish baby girl? What about that? If you're not going with the Pshita of Rav Nachman Yitzchak, who said that there was the Xerim saying that Anidus Mirsasan, you just say that the non-Jewish baby boys were also because you'll come to homosexuality or sodomy with the Goyim. What about a non-Jewish baby girl? At what age? She should be Tameh from, she shouldn't be secluded from the time that she's 3 years old. If you say that when should you consider a non-Jewish baby boy Tameh? From 9 years old, because that's when he can have bia, then you should consider him Tameh there. The same way, a girl is considered capable of bia from 3 years old, so she should be Tameh from there. Now, right? She's also Tameh from that point because she's roy for bia. So more pshita, isn't it obvious? The same a 9-year-old boy can seduce a woman, so at that point he should be considered Tameh. But a 3-year-old girl is not going to seduce anybody, and therefore maybe she should also only be Tameh later on from an advanced age, like 9 years old. Kamash Malan, that we don't say that. We say from the time that she's roy for bia, which is 3 years old in a day. That's what Rashi says in the third line. So in the Kamash Malan, that where it goes or even from 3 years old. So it comes out that a non-Jewish baby boy is Tameh from birth. And not really Tameh from birth, but it's Tameh from, let's say, 9 years old in a day, from time to bia, and a non-Jewish girl only from the age of 3. All right, we'll pick it up from here tomorrow. Mitzvah Hashem, from the 6th line, the beginning of the 6th line, where we're up to now. Pick it up from there tomorrow. Have a good day, everybody. Call to.
Good day, Back.